and whether the department is planning to shut down Breeze or working to reduce costs pending legislative action. Immediately upon receipt of the letter on February 25th, the department instantly engaged the Department of Technology to discuss impacts and options with Accenture. Thanks to Caltech, Accenture has agreed to continue working on the project through the end of March to allow the legislative committees additional time to consider the department's requests. However, there will be additional costs to the boards and bureaus because of this delay. Second, the committees have noted that the department should discuss its long-term plan for moving forward with Breeze, including anticipated costs and timelines for providing IT solutions for the boards and bureaus in the third release. I agree, as this is in line with the report of the state auditor, which recommended a cost-benefit analysis be conducted before we determine how or even whether to bring those entities into Breeze. This is the smart thing to do. We have to figure out what we need before we proceed with another contract. We have begun discussions with Caltech and how to proceed with a cost-benefit analysis after the second release is completed. Third, the committees have recommended that we explain how Breeze charges were calculated for boards and bureaus in SPR 3.1, especially with respect to those boards in the third release. In addition, the department has been requested to share how those costs will affect license fees and how any deficiencies will be met. The Breeze project costs are allocated amongst the boards and bureaus based upon their respective share of DCA's overall annual initial license applications and renewals. Only the boards and bureaus in the first and second release will pay for the design, development, and implementation, also known as DDI, contract. That is the large contract that for the most part we're talking about. The programs in the third release are only paying a share of the initial hardware, software investment costs, and not the DDI contract. Although Breeze may be a contributing factor, it is not solely responsible for fee increases at any of the boards or bureaus. There are many other factors that may contribute to a need to increase fees. We closely monitor the fund conditions of all of our boards and bureaus and have identified 17 whose funding is projected to drop below the 3-month reserve, mostly due to structural imbalances caused by increased enforcement and consumer protection costs over the past several years. 5 of those entities are planning fee increases. All are at various stages of conducting fee audits to determine the appropriate fee levels for their programs. The fourth question regarding Breeze asks when DCA knew the boards and bureaus in the third release were going to be cut from the contract, why they are paying for Breeze, what they are paying for, and whether any will receive refunds. Last summer, DCA, Caltech, and the Department of Finance, after due deliberation, determined the best way to control escalating costs was to sever the contract with our vendor after the second release. The other 2 options, namely stopping the project or pausing the project, would have resulted in substantial financial costs to the state. As I mentioned previously, we will do a cost-benefit analysis after the second release has concluded to determine how best to proceed for those boards and bureaus in the third release. Absent any findings to the contrary, our vision is still to bring those boards and bureaus into Breeze. The boards and bureaus in the third release have contributed to the initial hardware and software purchase and staffing for Breeze. However, they have not and will not contribute to the current implementation costs. We will not know whether those boards and bureaus remaining should receive refunds until after the cost-benefit analysis is completed and we determine what the best course is. 5, I'd like to now turn to the committee's question regarding the availability of enforcement reports and whether boards have been given all the tools they need to extract the reports. The Enforcement Performance Measures reports is available to the boards and has been since November of last year. The data is there and available to use. However, some of our boards express specific concerns regarding a limited number of data points on that report. Given that, we have taken proactive steps to address and resolve their concerns. For example, we have convened a user group comprised of staff and boards from the boards and bureaus who designed and developed improved enforcement reports to better meet their needs. These changes will be incorporated into Breeze by the end of the fiscal year. The reporting tools currently available to the boards include the ability to extract some data from Breeze system without the assistance from DCA's IT staff. For more complex reporting needs, the department has made its IT staff available to provide ad hoc data sets to boards upon request. These ad hoc data sets requests help address the immediate reporting needs until the enhanced enforcement reports are available this spring. Finally, the committees have asked how Breeze's enforcement functions are working, whether they are working better than licensing, and if so, why. Breeze is meeting the operational day-to-day needs of the boards in the first release and is continuing to improve its functionality. Several enhancements are underway, including the enforcement reports that I just spoke of, which will improve its performance. The enforcement functionality is much easier to design than licensing functionality. That is because enforcement processes are similar across all DCA's boards and bureaus and are more conducive to standardization. With this, Chairman, this concludes my testimony regarding Breeze. We will provide written testimony regarding the other issues identified by the committees in the background document. Again, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity to give these comments, and I look forward to questions that these bodies may have.
Very good, thank you. First question that comes to mind for me, you mentioned that, you know, as you were looking at after phase one and then the termination of the contract, moving forward with the termination of the contract with Accenture, what was the reason to do that when we just heard that Accenture is, you know, a number of fiscal, number of agencies, departments in the state have worked with Accenture and seem to have been evidently somewhat successful after some maybe rough beginnings. Why would you terminate that contract if they had proved themselves successful in the past?
The performance from Accenture on other contracts, I can't speak to. I can only speak to the constraints that the current contract gave me to implement the very lessons learned that Caltech, Department of Finance, and my department extracted after Release 1. In order to really make those changes, the current contract construct precluded me from implementing all of that. We realized that the current contract was not sustainable because we could not control costs or scope, and it was completely unsustainable as we started getting into what the 19 remaining boards, some very complex, some very small, had in store. There was missing functionality from the original contract that we knew we would have to bake in and pay for. So that was part of the thought process.
Are you looking at Accenture for the phase 3 implementation?
It would be that is premature, you know, to say it will be Accenture. The whole reason why the state is requesting to own the license to this code base so we can be much more agile, have the code base, and then figure out what we need, and then let the vendor, whether it's Accenture or somebody else, give us the best bid on how to integrate into our code base that we then own, or I'm sorry, own the license to.
Yeah. And as you know, these committees have been looking at Breeze system for years.
Yes.
And since its inception, and it appears that, you know, some problems have come, some have gone, and there have been some improvements, but I guess the challenge that we're faced with now with terminating is how can we have, I guess, the confidence. I I mean, especially in light of the amendments in November, that there have been questions raised by the auditor of the appropriateness of those amendments and the manner in which they were done. How can we feel confident? I know there'll be other questions, but I just, to succeed, if you're going to be the project leader, how do we, I don't have confidence, and I don't know if our other members do.
Well, I would say the confidence should be drawn from the very action that the state has taken thus far, which was quickly address the problems in the middle of testing, prioritize the solutions, which is the very amendment that the auditor spoke of, getting the boards in release one the necessary fixes they need at a quicker rate. That is the amendment that we spoke of. The second part of that is the much larger amendment that is in question, which is cutting off the contractual relationship to the third phase. The state would be remiss to continue on the current contract and continue racking up costs and putting my boards and bureaus' fund conditions in jeopardy. So although it is a completely undesirable position that we're in, given the current contract construct, what has happened, the best course of action is to pause, figure out a better course of action on how to implement the remaining boards.
But you said you acted promptly, or when you saw the problem. But
Yes.
This goes back, as the auditor raised, that when there was system testing that should have taken 8 weeks, took 11 months.
That's correct.
That goes back years when that process was, or 2 years perhaps, when that occurred. Wouldn't that have been the time to pull the plug at $27 million instead of $98 million, with half of the bureaus and boards successfully, or not even successfully yet? Certainly we don't know what phase 2 is going to bring, and phase 1 started with numerous problems that are still being addressed.
The testing phase was definitely a time when we explored all of our options with Caltech. The option to terminate, the option to cure, and the option to go forward and use the contract to the best of our abilities were the three scenarios that we were given. The unfortunate circumstance was that Accenture, because of the conditions and the requirements in the contract, Accenture was able to meet the contractual requirements. The problem was those contractual requirements did not meet the needs of our business. That is exactly why we had an 11-month testing window when our boards in the first release pretty much redesigned the system. So I'm not going to speak for...
If I could pass to Mr. Ramos, could you respond to that concern of when the problem was recognized, when the challenges were identified, and it looks like it goes back a couple of years, why at that point in time didn't Caltech take their, what I would consider, leadership role in IT analysis and oversight and make some major changes?
Certainly. So I guess what I would say is I don't agree that we didn't take our leadership role in doing analysis or making recommendations or even trying to modify the way that the project was going. Fundamentally, I think what you're seeing here is that there is the contract that was negotiated, the terms that you were asking about that were negotiated away back in 2010, 2011, fundamentally hamstrung the department and Caltech from being able to enforce some of those provisions. So, for example, pausing the project, canceling it, suspending it in any other way would have exposed the state to a lot of liability and a lot of cost to Accenture without really generating any progress on the system. So we were hamstrung in what actions we could take. I think the auditor was correct. The initial project didn't get the requirements right. That's what you're seeing here is a challenge of trying to build a system when the requirements weren't there. As the system is being developed, I think the department recognized that early on. I think when we came on board, we saw that we saw those issues as well. So the option was either, okay, stop it and pay the full value of the contract and don't get anything out of it, or modify the requirements so that you can get some value out of it. That was the path that ultimately we chose. One, because the contract, really severely limited our ability to do anything different. And then secondly, because as I don't know that it came out here, but, there's been a number of attempts to try and modernize the licensing systems over at DCA before that were not successful. This was a third attempt, I think, at trying to modify and update the licensing function. So fundamentally, from a business perspective, from a programmatic perspective, it is still and continues to be an overarching need for the department. We believe that BREEZE and the BREEZE project, even though, we worked at trying to modify the project contract, is still the best vehicle for getting there. There are a couple of other things that need to happen as well. So it's not to say that where we are today is perfect. But in direct answer to your question, we didn't stop the project at that point because that wasn't an option that was palatable, and we didn't think that was the appropriate action at the time.
You're saying that you supported the Accenture platform, I guess, is what we're talking about, and as it moved forward, yet there's a termination of the contract today. Do you still believe that Accenture could produce what was in the original contract and then could go into the phase 3 if possible, if it warranted, and if the...
I think it's important to understand the purpose of terminating the relationship with Accenture. As I mentioned before, we have a bad contract. It's not so much that that Accenture as a contractor isn't a good contractor. As I mentioned earlier, they've delivered systems here in California. The contract and the model of the project that we have today doesn't allow us to effectively manage it in a way that puts the state in the driver's seat. So the idea of ending the relationship with Accenture, even the idea of breaking apart the maintenance contract from the development and design project is an effort to try and give the state more control and put us back in the driver's seat, to allow us to maintain the system, for example. Even if we say, okay, Accenture, we're done with you, go away, we bring somebody else in, or the state decides to maintain the system on its own, we need the ability to maintain, to modify the code, to maintain it, to make configuration changes, and to customize it as need be for the needs of the remaining boards or the ones that are in place now.
Okay, and thank you for the answer, and I'll ask Director Kidani this next question as well. It seems that all of the blame is going and the responsibility is going to that original contract. The original contract and the manner in which it was drawn, whether it's legal oversight and the conditions of that contract that needed to be changed, and that's why we're in the position we are in today. Are those people who worked on that contract, signed off on that contract, are they still in your department?
They're not in, as far as I know, they're not in my department. They weren't in my department back then.
So
back then they were
the same
Department
people
of General
working in the same
Services.
field? They may not be in the department wasn't there then, but did they migrate from DGS to the Department of
We got
Technology?
some staff from DGS, and honestly, I don't know who were the, do you know, Marnell?
Well, I mean, I think we should know if those, I mean, I don't need to know personally, but my concern is that those are not people that we would want to.
That person's no longer, or is not with our department. But just to get back to the point earlier, I'm not saying all of the blame or all of the issues that have happened with the project tied directly to the contract. I'm just, that is certainly a major factor and a major consideration. There have been other issues along the way, including the fact that the requirements weren't right to begin with.
Exactly. I mean, obviously the department takes a lot of responsibility for that.
And I would say, Mr. Chair, one other thing that, if you don't mind, our own oversight of the project has evolved over the course of the life cycle of this project. At the very beginning, for example, we didn't have procurement oversight. The way that this agency and its predecessor agency approached providing oversight on active projects was different. As the auditor observed, and actually she didn't mention it, but initially oversight was contracted out. Eventually that was brought in-house, and then our department, began providing oversight directly. We now engage much earlier in the process, and even the processes that we use to approve projects is quite modified and quite different than the way it was done back then.
And who is it contracted out to? A private company?
Do you recall, Becky? It was a private company. I don't.
Well, we can find out. And Ms.
Oh,
Howell, you wanted-
MetaVista.
That's correct. I did read that. Yes, Ms. Howell, then.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to make one comment with respect, and we absolutely agree, based on the analysis that my legal staff did of the contract, that the state was put in a very disadvantageous position. But the point that I think is important to make is we have a flow chart in the report. Even though IV&V and IPO, this oversight got started late, the issues that were identified before the contract was signed. Some of these significant issues were being identified in January of 2011. This contract with the state of California was not signed until September of 2011. So we believe there were enough significant issues being raised by this, even though it was contracted out, or the IPO being done by Caltech, there were issues that were significant enough for the state to say, to be more cautious and be agreeing to remove some of the provisions. Why are we willing to take on more risk by removing some of these provisions if we already know 7 months before this contract is even signed that we're having issues, and significant types of issues, risk management, staffing, not having adequate staff. The RFP had inadequate requirements, as Mr. Ramos indicated. We knew, as a state, we knew that before we signed that contract in September of 2011. I think that's an important point that the committee needs to know.